A ditch, late morning, high summer, light falling in strips through a gap in green. A private first class named Ray Register lies flat against the earthen bank of a Norman hedgerow, a scoped 193 rifle resting across his forearms. He is not shooting, he is waiting. He does not know exactly where the German is. He knows only that a German is there, somewhere in 60 yards of thorn and packed dirt across the field, because 4 minutes earlier the German fired a single round, and a man near Register is now being carried back through the corn on a poncho. One shot. That is enough to stop an advance dead in its tracks. Register does not return fire. Not yet. Beside him lies an artillery observer, a soldier whose actual job is to call in barrages on map coordinates, not to lie in a wet ditch helping a rifleman find one man in a hedge. But the manual that assigned him that job had never seen this terrain. 2 men, 2 sets of eyes on the same 60 yards, checking each other's guess against what neither can confirm alone. Then Register fires once. From the far ditch comes a cry, a visible thrash of movement, and then a long, complete silence. This is not a story about marksmanship. Marksmanship was never the hard part. This is a story about what an American army, 6 weeks into a campaign nobody had planned for, built out of ordinary men, borrowed equipment, and improvised cooperation, in order to make sure that one German rifle shot was always the last one its owner got to fire. The version of this story that survives in memory is a simple one. A lone marksman duel, rifle against rifle, patience against patience, the better shot walking away. It is not false so much as incomplete, and the missing piece changes what the story is actually about. Read the after-action language closely, the reports filed by the men who lived it, and a different picture appears, not one gifted eye against another, but a system. Riflemen paired with observers who were never trained to spot for them. Infantry sections that learned, position by position, which fold in the ground let a man see without being seen. So why did an American rifle company, on paper the weaker one, routinely outhunt a German sniper on ground built for him? Not because of a better rifle, because of a second set of eyes and a habit of trusting them. An institutional problem, solved from the bottom up, faster than any manual could be rewritten to catch up with it. To understand why that system had to be invented at all, you have to go back past the ditch, past Normandy even, to the terrain itself, and to how badly the planners who studied it from the air had misjudged what it would mean to fight through it on the ground. The French call it bocage, a word for hedge country that sounds almost pastoral until you've tried to move an army through it. Norman farmers had been building it for 1,000 years, fields no larger than a few acres, each one boxed in by an earthen bank 3 or 4 feet high, packed dense with centuries of root and stone, and crowned with a hedge of thorn and beech grown so thick a man could not see through it at 10 feet, let alone 60. War correspondent Ira Wolfert put it plainly in a dispatch from the front. The hedges are thick and green and all brambly. You can't see through them. 4 words carry the weight of that sentence. You can't see through. Not can't see far. Can't see through. The distinction is the whole military problem in miniature. Allied planners had studied aerial photographs of this country for months before the invasion, and had still gotten it wrong, because a photograph taken from 10,000 feet cannot show you what it feels like to stand in a sunken lane with banks rising over your head on both sides, unable to see the next field, let alone the one after that. Divisions that had trained for open maneuver warfare in the American South and the English Downs found themselves fighting, instead, a war of a few dozen yards at a time, hedge to hedge, with no clean way to tell a defended field from an empty one until someone walked into it. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American First Army, inspected the hedgerow country in person on June 8, 1944, 2 days after the landings, and afterward said, "It was the damnedest country I've ever seen." That is not hyperbole from a man not given to hyperbole. It is a professional soldier discovering, in real time, that his own doctrine had no category for the ground he was standing on. The tactical mathematics were brutal and specific. Each hedged field was its own sealed box, reachable from the next only through a gate, a gap, or a narrow lane worn down over centuries by cart traffic, and every one of those openings could be covered by a single rifle, a single machine gun, or a single well-concealed man with a scope. German defenders, drawn from divisions including the 352nd, the 275, and elements of Panzer Lehr and the 3rd Parachute Division, understood this arithmetic before the first American boot crossed the first hedge line, because they had studied it, or simply lived beside it, for years. A German rifle company in Normandy carried roughly 20 machine guns and 43 submachine guns to an American rifle company's 2 light machine guns and 9 Browning automatic rifles, a firepower gap that made every hedge-to-hedge fight, on paper, an unfavorable trade for the attacker before a single German sniper ever entered the equation. And the snipers did enter the equation, embedded into that same defensive lattice, digging shallow slit trenches into the reverse slope of hedge banks, sometimes holding a single position for 2 to 5 days at a stretch, waiting specifically for tank commanders exposed in open turrets, and for the officers and radiomen whose deaths would do the most damage to a unit's ability to think. This is not a story about one side being monstrous and the other virtuous. The men digging into those hedge banks were, for the most part, competent professional soldiers executing a defense that made excellent tactical sense on ground built, almost accidentally, for exactly this kind of war. Grant them the terrain, built over 1,000 years for exactly this purpose. Grant them the firepower, 20 machine guns to 2. Grant them the patience, days at a stretch in a single slit trench, waiting. None of it would be enough. Something else was about to be true of this ground that none of that training had prepared them for. Before you can follow the fighting hour by hour, you need the names of the people inside it, because the record, where it survives, survives through them. Private First Class Ray Register, of Slocum, Alabama, carried a scoped bolt-action 1903 rifle, and a patience that outlasted most men's nerves. Before the ditch duel that opens this account, he had already used the same rifle at roughly 350 yards to stop a German machine gun crew before it could set up, firing 4 rounds nearly as fast as he could work the bolt. Staff Sergeant W.L. Maiko, of Colorado Springs, Colorado, fought with 5 confirmed kills to his name by midsummer, several of them German riflemen shot out of trees in the first weeks of the advance inland, a detail that matters, because it marks the exact moment the tactic it describes stopped working. A man in a tree has excellent sight lines and no way down but the one everyone can see. Technical Sergeant James R. Foffen, of Staunton, Virginia, served as a scout, the man sent ahead of his platoon to draw contact before the rest of the unit walked into it, a job that required accepting the highest personal risk in exchange for the earliest possible warning to everyone behind him. Sergeant H. Carrington of Georgia was, by the account of the correspondent who interviewed him in the field, unhurried to the point of strangeness under fire. A man who, at roughly 300 yards, took the time to settle into a comfortable kneeling position before taking a single shot that ended a German soldier's life instantly. Their words survive because a war correspondent named Bill Shadle went looking for them. Shadle filed his report from Normandy on July 25, 1944, and it ran that September in the American Riflemen, built entirely from conversations with riflemen like these 4, men whose names would otherwise have vanished into division rosters. Shadle wrote one line that, on its own, tells you the ending of this entire story before the story has finished being told. The rifle marksmanship of the Americans has caused a marked decline in the popularity of the tree sniper idea. Marked decline. Popularity. Those are strange, almost commercial words for describing men dying, and that is exactly the point. Shadle is describing an adaptation under pressure, a tactic being priced out of use by its casualty rate, in language borrowed from a marketplace rather than a battlefield. On the other side of the hedge, take one man seriously rather than as a symbol. General Lieutenant Eugen Meindl commanded the German 2 Parachute Corps in the Normandy fighting, an officer with a reputation, earned over the war's earlier years, for competence under exactly the kind of pressure his men were now applying to the Americans in front of them. His paratroopers were volunteers, drawn from an elite recruitment stream, trained to a standard that regular infantry divisions on both sides did not match, and dug into the bocage with the patience of men who had trained specifically for static, attritional defense of fixed ground. They would hold their sector through weeks of fighting that cost both armies enormously, and when Meindl finally judged the position untenable, he did not break and run. He asked, through channels, for permission to withdraw. That request would not come until the 18th of July, and what happened to it belongs later in this account. Think about what it meant to move through a landscape built, wall by wall, to hide a single man with a rifle. That is the landscape the next 12 days were fought inside of. Dawn, the 7th of July, 1944. The battle for the town of St. Lo, the road junction that both armies needed and that neither could simply walk into, formally began. It would run for 12 more days. At 0300 hours that morning, the 30th Infantry Division crossed the Vire River under fire, the opening move in a push that Bradley had ordered to break the German line west of the town. Progress, where it came at all, was measured in yards. On July 8 alone, 8 Corps absorbed roughly 3,000 additional casualties for ground that would not have covered a modern parking lot. By July 11th, the 1116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Division, attacked along Martinville Ridge at 0600 hours, straight into a German counterattack mounted by Panzer Lehr and the 2nd SS Panzer Division. The fighting there cost Panzer Lehr an estimated 500 to 700 men and 32 tanks in a single day. By its own commander's later account, roughly half the division's attacking strength, gone in hours. 2 days later, on July 13th, the 35th Division's 13th 4th Infantry Regiment began its own grinding push toward Hill 1222, a wooded rise that let whoever held it see and shoot at everything moving below. Numbers alone cannot carry what happened inside those hedges, so look instead at one company. The 116th Rifle Companies had gone into Normandy at strength, 150 to 180 men each. By the time St. Lo fell, some of those companies numbered around 60. Every yard gained meant crossing an opening a defender had already ranged. Every hedge line taken meant the next one, unseen, might already hold a rifle sighted on the exact gap a squad would have to use. Every silence between shots meant either an empty field or a patient man deciding whether the target was worth revealing himself for. This is where the sniper hunting actually happened, not as isolated duels, but as a rhythm repeated hundreds of times across those 12 days. A shot, a man down, the rest of the squad flat against the earth, and then, instead of simply waiting out the position, which a single dug-in rifleman could sustain for days, a deliberate, almost procedural response. No 1943 field manual had a page written for it, a rifleman lying beside a man trained for artillery. Neither of them rehearsed for this, both wagering their lives on the other's eyes. A section leader would mark the estimated direction of the shot by ear and by the visible reaction of his own men. A Browning automatic rifle team would put suppressing fire into the suspected hedge line, while 2 or 3 men worked sideways along the bank, using the very compartmentalization that had made the position dangerous to now make it inescapable. If artillery or mortar observers were within call, as they increasingly were by mid-July, a forward observer might be borrowed for exactly what happened in Register's ditch, a second, trained set of eyes cross-checking a suspected position before a single shot committed the rifleman to revealing his own. The German sniper's structural advantage, the box of hedges he had chosen precisely because it limited what an attacker could see, cut both ways once he was located. He had nowhere left to retreat to. The same walls that hid him also sealed him in. Sergeant Robert L. Fowler of the 35th Division's 13th 4th Infantry Regiment lived through a single engagement in the hedge country that left 36 of his company's 42 men dead. He recorded, in an account preserved by the unit's history, one line from that fight that reads almost like a stage direction rather than a memory. On along the hedge, and there are men standing looking at me. They are not GIs. Not GIs. 4 syllables, and in them the entire vertigo of hedgerow combat. The moment recognition and threat assessment arrive in the same half-second, because the terrain gave no warning before it. Captain Charles Foffen, executive officer of the 2nd Battalion, 116th Infantry, wrote afterward of the field around Martinville Ridge. A pall of smoke was over the fields, holding in it the sweet, sickening stench of high explosives. Sweet and sickening in the same clause. A soldier's nose has learned, by 1944, that violence has an actual smell, and that some part of the body registers it as something close to pleasant before the mind catches up and corrects the error. That correction, arriving a half-second late, is itself a kind of testimony. Historian Stephen Zaloga, assessing the campaign decades later, called it plainly, "The Battle of the Hedgerows involved no dramatic advances or decisive maneuvers. It was a grinding battle of attrition. No maneuver, no decisive stroke, just the slow, repeated act of finding one man in one hedge, again and again and again." On July 17th, Major Thomas D. Howe, commanding the 3rd Battalion of the 116th Infantry, led a bayonet charge to relieve another battalion that German forces had surrounded. He broke the encirclement. Hours later, a mortar fragment killed him. His executive officer, Captain William Puntney, had been in a briefing with Howe shortly before, and later described the ordinary texture of that final meeting. Men receiving orders, dismissed, walking back to their positions, with no premonition attached to any of it. That is what death in the bocage typically looked like. Not a duel, an interruption. He would not survive to see the town he had helped open the road into. That sentence needs to sit for a moment before the account moves on. The road into St. Lo. That is where this converges. Two forces of a different kind had been moving toward it from different directions for nearly 2 weeks. American infantry grinding forward hedge by hedge from the north and east, and, less visibly, a mechanical solution arriving from the rear echelon, where ordnance units had been welding scavenged steel into makeshift prongs bolted to the front of Sherman tanks. Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen, building on an early prototype devised by First Lieutenant Charles B. Green, is credited with the design that became standard, a set of steel tusks, cut from German beach obstacles, that let a tank cut directly through a hedge bank instead of climbing over it and exposing its unarmored belly to the exact kind of concealed defender this account has been describing. Major General Charles Gerhardt reported the device's battlefield success on August 5, 1944. General Eisenhower called it, without exaggeration, a godsend. It is worth pausing on what that device actually did to the sniper problem, because it is not what the marksmanship stories suggest. The rifleman with the scoped 1903 and the patient eye mattered. The observer who lay in the ditch beside him mattered more than doctrine had ever planned for. But the machine that ended the sniper's structural advantage for good was not a better rifle. It was a piece of scrap steel that let an American tank go straight through the wall the sniper had been hiding inside of, rather than around it. St. Lo fell on July 19, 1944. What remained of it was rubble. American consular estimates after the war put the destruction at as high as 97% of the town's buildings. French municipal figures, counted differently, run closer to 95. The two figures disagree on the last 2 points and agree completely on everything that matters. Journalists would give it a name that stuck for the rest of the century, the capital of ruins. When the 29th Division entered the town on July 18th, Major General Gerhardt ordered that Thomas Howey's body be carried on the hood of the lead jeep, so that the man who had died opening the road would be, in the only sense still available to him, the first American soldier to enter it. His men laid his stretcher on the rubble of the St. Croix Church, one of the few structures still partly standing, an unexploded shell still lodged in its wall. The wider cost of those 12 days is easy to state and hard to absorb. First Army casualties for the hedgerow fighting, from the start of July to the fall of St. Lo, ran past 11,000 men killed. Fewer than 3 weeks of fighting cost the First Army more than 40,000 casualties in total, killed, wounded, and missing combined. That sounds like an exaggeration. It was not. Behind every one of those numbers is a version of the same ditch register lay in, the same 60 yards of thorn, the same single shot deciding, in less than a second, which side of the statistic a man would end up on. The riflemen from Schädel's dispatch mostly disappear from the record after that summer, which is itself worth stating plainly rather than filling with invention. Ray Register, Maiko, Foffen, Carrington. The reports that preserve their names are dated July 1944, and in the available record, largely end there. What became of each of them afterward, whether they went home whole, wounded, or not at all, the surviving documents do not say. That silence is not an oversight in this account. It is the truth of what the record actually contains. General Lieutenant Mindel's request to withdraw his 2 parachute corps, filed on July 18th, arrived at the moment the position it concerned had already become indefensible in fact, rather than merely in prospect. His corps, like the rest of the German 7th Army in Normandy, would be driven back within weeks and largely destroyed in the encirclement at Falaise that August. He was, by the professional measure his American opponents used to judge him, a serious commander who had done everything doctrine could ask of a defender on that ground, and it had not been enough. Curtis Cullen, the sergeant whose welded steel tusks did more damage to the German defensive scheme than any single rifleman, was wounded later that summer near St. Lo and awarded the Legion of Merit. The U.S. Army would go on to fit hedgerow cutters onto more than 500 tanks before the campaign moved past the bocage entirely, and the device itself became obsolete, a solution manufactured for a problem that would exist for only a few more weeks. The institutions handled the story unevenly. The tank innovation got a citation, a general's public praise, a place in the official history. The riflemen who had spent June and July learning, position by position, how to turn a single incoming shot into a coordinate, a flank, and a silence, got 4 paragraphs in a magazine that most Americans read for its coverage of hunting rifles. They had no ready category for what those men had actually done. It was not the individually heroic marksmanship the folklore prefers. It was not, either, a simple story of superior equipment, since the Germans, gun for gun, often had the advantage in a hedge-line firefight. What the record actually shows is something harder to put on a monument, a system of ordinary cooperation. Riflemen and forward observers and section leaders trading fragments of a picture none of them could complete alone, built in the field, without a manual, because the manual that existed when the landing craft touched down on June 6th had no answer for what waited past the beach. Go back to the ditch outside St. Lo, to Ray Register and the artillery observer beside him who was never supposed to be there. The German who fired first is not named in any surviving document. Neither is the exact date. What survives is a shape, one shot, a wounded man carried back through corn, two soldiers cross-checking a guess neither could confirm alone, and then a second shot that ended it. This is not a story about revenge, or about which side could shoot straighter under pressure, or about a rifle better than another rifle. It is a story about what a single shot actually costs the man who fires it, once the terrain that was supposed to hide him has been read correctly by the men he meant to kill. The bocage gave every defender a box to hide in. It also meant that once found, he had no second field to fall back into. That was never a rule written in a doctrine. It was a fact about hedges that both armies had to discover the hard way, one silence at a time. The long quiet that followed Register's second shot was not an ending. It was the sound the war made, that summer, whenever a system finally caught up with a single man's advantage. And it would be heard again, hedge after hedge, all the way to the ruins of a town nobody had meant to destroy.